Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we are going to talk about a deeply serious and sensitive incident reported from Gaza City, where Israeli soldiers allegedly fired over what has been described as a yellow line, leading to an attack that killed at least 6 Palestinians. This is not an easy topic, but it is an important one to understand in context, with clarity, and with respect for the human cost involved. Reports indicate that the incident took place in a densely populated area of Gaza City, a place where civilians live, move, and try to survive under extremely difficult conditions. According to local sources, gunfire was opened after people crossed or approached a marked boundary, often referred to as a yellow line, which is said to represent a restricted or controlled zone. The concept of a yellow line in conflict zones is not new. Such lines are often used by military forces to mark areas that are considered off-limits for security reasons. However, the presence of civilians near or beyond these lines raises serious questions about enforcement, proportionality, and the rules governing the use of force. Witnesses on the ground have described moments of confusion and panic. People reportedly did not fully understand whether they were allowed to cross the area or how strictly the boundary was being enforced at that moment. In environments like Gaza, where space is limited and daily survival often requires movement through dangerous areas, these lines can become deadly flashpoints. The attack reportedly resulted in the deaths of at least 6 Palestinians, with others injured. Behind every number is a human life, a family, and a story that will never be fully told. The loss of life in such circumstances deepens existing wounds and adds to the collective trauma experienced by the population. Israeli military statements in similar past incidents often emphasize security concerns. These usually include claims that soldiers felt threatened or that the area was clearly designated as restricted. From a military perspective, such explanations are framed around preventing potential attacks or infiltration. On the other hand, Palestinian officials and human rights groups argue that the use of live fire against civilians is unjustified and violates international humanitarian law. They stress that civilians, even when crossing restricted zones, should not be met with lethal force unless there is an immediate and clear threat to life. This incident cannot be viewed in isolation. It is part of a much larger and longer conflict that has shaped every aspect of life in Gaza and Israel. Decades of tension, wars, blockades, and failed peace efforts have created an environment where fear, mistrust, and violence are deeply entrenched. Gaza City itself is one of the most densely populated urban areas in the world. Many residents live just meters away from zones controlled or monitored by Israeli forces. In such conditions, misunderstandings and confrontations can escalate rapidly, often with devastating consequences. The rules of engagement used by military forces are supposed to balance security needs with the protection of civilian lives. International law requires that force be used only when necessary and in proportion to the threat faced. Incidents like this raise urgent questions about how these rules are applied on the ground. Human rights organizations frequently call for independent investigations into such killings. They argue that without accountability, similar incidents will continue to occur. Investigations are seen as a way to establish facts, determine responsibility, and provide some measure of justice to victims' families. For families in Gaza, the aftermath of such an attack is marked by grief, anger, and a sense of helplessness. Funerals become both personal moments of mourning and public expressions of pain and protest. Children grow up witnessing violence as a normal part of life, shaping their understanding of the world from a very young age. The psychological impact of repeated exposure to violence cannot be overstated. Studies from conflict zones show high levels of trauma, anxiety, and depression, especially among children. Every new incident reinforces a cycle of fear and resentment that is incredibly difficult to break. From the Israeli side, communities near Gaza also live under constant stress. Rocket attacks, alarms, and the threat of violence create their own form of trauma. Many Israelis view strict security measures as necessary for survival, given the history of attacks against their civilians. This dual reality fuels a narrative where each side feels victimized and justified. Such narratives make compromise harder and deepen polarization. Media coverage often reflects this divide, depending on the source and audience, further shaping public opinion in conflicting ways. International reactions to incidents like this are often swift but limited. Statements of concern, calls for restraint, and demands for investigation are common. However, meaningful action or change on the ground is far less frequent, leading to frustration among affected populations. The role of international law is central in discussions about civilian deaths. The Geneva Conventions and other legal frameworks are designed to protect civilians in times of war and occupation. Alleged violations, such as firing on unarmed civilians, are taken very seriously by legal experts. At the same time, enforcing international law in active conflict zones is extremely challenging. Political alliances, veto powers, and strategic interests often prevent strong collective action. This leaves many incidents unresolved and victims without clear paths to justice. Social media has changed how such events are witnessed and remembered. Videos, photos, and first-hand accounts can spread globally within minutes. While this increases awareness, it can also spread misinformation or inflame emotions before facts are fully verified. In Gaza, access to medical care after attacks is another major concern. Hospitals are often overwhelmed and under-resourced. Injured people may face delays in treatment, which can turn survivable wounds into fatal ones. The economic situation in Gaza further compounds the suffering. High unemployment, restricted movement, and limited access to basic goods mean that families already struggling to survive are pushed even closer to the edge after such tragedies. For journalists and analysts, reporting on these incidents requires careful language. Words matter because they shape how audiences understand responsibility, intent, and impact. Neutrality is often criticized by both sides, yet emotionally charged reporting can also distort reality. This particular incident has reignited debates about buffer zones and the ethics of enforcing them with lethal force. Critics argue that clearer warnings, non-lethal measures, and better communication could prevent deaths. Supporters of strict enforcement argue that any relaxation could be exploited by armed groups, putting soldiers and civilians at risk. This tension between security and humanity lies at the heart of many confrontations in the region. Ultimately, the victims of such incidents are not just those who lose their lives. Entire communities suffer long-term consequences. Trust erodes further, anger grows deeper, and the prospects for peace become more distant. Understanding this incident requires acknowledging complexity without losing sight of basic human values. Every life lost is a tragedy, regardless of politics or borders. Recognizing the humanity on all sides is essential, even when opinions differ sharply. As viewers, it is important to seek information from multiple sources, question narratives, and remain aware of the broader context. Simplistic explanations rarely capture the full reality of events on the ground. The situation in Gaza and Israel continues to evolve, with each incident adding another layer to an already complicated history. What happened over the reported yellow line is one chapter in a long and painful story that has yet to find a peaceful resolution. The hope expressed by many ordinary people on both sides is for a future where boundaries do not mean death, where security does not come at the cost of civilian lives, and where children can grow up without the constant shadow of violence. Until such a future is achieved, incidents like this will continue to demand attention, accountability, and reflection. They challenge the international community to move beyond statements and toward meaningful engagement. This is not just about one line on the ground or one moment of gunfire. It is about systems, decisions, and histories that shape how force is used and how lives are valued. As we reflect on this incident, the most important thing to remember is the human cost. 6 lives lost means 6 families changed forever, and countless others affected in ways that may never be fully visible. Thank you for watching, and take a moment to think about the realities faced by people living in conflict zones every single day.